10-year-old Danny pressed his face against the cold window pane, watching raindrops race down the glass. The dreary weather matched his mood perfectly. He sighed, his breath fogging up the window, and turned back to face the sparse dormitory of St. Martha's orphanage. 6 identical beds lined the walls, but only 5 were occupied. The empty one had belonged to his best friend Tommy, who'd been adopted last month. Danny was happy for Tommy, truly he was, but his absence left a gaping hole in Danny's heart. As he flopped onto his bed, a crumpled letter fell from his pocket. With trembling hands, he smoothed it out, reading the words he'd memorized weeks ago. My dearest Danny, I hope this letter finds you well. I miss you more than words can say. I'm sorry I haven't been able to visit lately. The doctors say I need surgery. But don't you worry about me. I'll find a way. I always do. Stay strong, my little songbird. I love you. Your Grandma Rose. Danny's eyes stung with unshed tears. He hadn't seen Grandma Rose in months, not since she'd fallen ill and could no longer care for him. The orphanage was supposed to be temporary, just until she got better. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Danny's hope began to fade. He clutched the letter to his chest, remembering the warm summer evenings spent on Grandma's porch. She'd rock in her creaky chair, eyes closed in contentment, as Danny sang the lullabies she'd taught him. You have a gift, Danny, she'd often say. Your voice can touch hearts and heal souls. A plan began to form in Danny's mind. If his voice could heal souls, maybe it could heal bodies too. Or at least, maybe it could earn enough money to pay for Grandma's surgery. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight, and Mrs. Higgins, the night matron, would be making her final rounds soon. Danny's heart raced as he made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act now. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and pulled on his warmest sweater. He stuffed his few belongings into his school backpack. A change of clothes, his toothbrush, and a dog-eared photo of him and Grandma Rose. After a moment's hesitation, he added his prized possession, a small MP3 player loaded with karaoke tracks, a birthday gift from Grandma before she got sick. Danny tiptoed to the window, wincing at every creak of the old floorboards. He'd discovered weeks ago that this particular window had a broken lock, a secret he'd kept to himself. Now, it would be his ticket to freedom. With shaking hands, he pushed the window open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Danny took one last look at the sleeping forms of his roommates, whispering a silent goodbye. Then, summoning all his courage, he climbed onto the windowsill. The ground seemed impossibly far away, but a conveniently placed drainpipe offered a precarious route down. Danny took a deep breath, sent up a quick prayer, and began his descent. His shoes hit the wet grass with a soft thud, and for a moment he stood frozen, certain he'd be caught. But the orphanage remained silent and dark. He'd done it. He was out. With no time to celebrate his small victory, Danny darted across the lawn and squeezed through a gap in the iron fence. He paused on the sidewalk, realizing he had no idea where to go next. The city stretched out before him, vast and intimidating. But somewhere in that sprawling metropolis was a restaurant where he could sing. Somewhere out there was the key to saving Grandma Rose, and Danny was determined to find it. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, a small figure could be seen walking determinedly down the empty street, his backpack bouncing with each step. Danny didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was never going back to St. Martha's. His adventure had only just begun. The morning sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds as Danny trudged along the bustling sidewalks of downtown. His initial excitement had faded, replaced by a gnawing hunger and bone-deep weariness. He'd been walking for hours, ducking into alleys whenever he spotted a police car, terrified of being sent back to St. Martha's. The city was nothing like he'd imagined. Instead of the gleaming skyscrapers and friendly faces he'd seen on TV, he found himself surrounded by grime-covered buildings and hurried pedestrians who barely spared him a glance. The few who did look at him wore expressions of suspicion or pity, making Danny shrink further into his oversized sweater. As he turned a corner, the heavens opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, drenching Danny within seconds. He huddled under the awning of a closed shop, watching people rush by with umbrellas and raincoats. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday's dinner at the orphanage. Across the street, a neon sign flickered to life. Mel's Diner, open 24/7. The smell of fried food wafted towards Danny, making his mouth water. He knew he should save his meager funds for emergencies, but surely a small meal wouldn't hurt. Decision made, he darted across the street, narrowly avoiding a taxi that honked angrily at him. The warmth of the diner enveloped Danny as he pushed open the door, accompanied by the cheerful tinkle of a bell. A few patrons looked up briefly before returning to their meals. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with frizzy red hair tied back in a messy bun raised an eyebrow at the soaking wet boy. "You lost, kid?" she asked, her voice gruff but not unkind. Danny shook his head, water droplets flying from his hair. "No, ma'am. I'd like to order, please." The woman, her name tag read Darlene, looked skeptical but shrugged. "All right then, what'll it be?" Danny scanned the menu, his heart sinking at the prices. Even the cheapest item would take most of his money. But then his eyes landed on something perfect. Today's special all-you-can-eat pancakes, $5.99. "The pancake special, please," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Darlene nodded, scribbling on her notepad. "Coming right up. Take a seat wherever you like." Danny chose a small booth near the back, away from the windows. As he waited, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the next table. "I'm telling you, Joe, this place is going under," a man in a business suit was saying. "Ever since that new fusion restaurant opened down the block, Mel's been losing customers left and right." His companion, an older man with salt and pepper hair, sighed heavily. "It's a crying shame. This diner's been here for 40 years. Mel's going to have to do something drastic to turn things around." Their words sparked an idea in Danny's mind. Before he could think it through, Darlene arrived with a towering stack of pancakes. "Here you go, hun. Syrup's on the table. Holler if you need anything else." Danny mumbled his thanks, his mouth already full of the most delicious pancakes he'd ever tasted. As he ate, he worked up the courage to put his plan into action. It was risky, but if it worked. Wiping his mouth with a napkin, Danny approached the counter where Darlene was refilling salt shakers. "Excuse me, ma'am?" She looked up, surprised. "Everything okay with your pancakes, kid?" "Oh, yes, they're wonderful," Danny assured her. "I was just wondering, does this place ever have live music?" Darlene snorted. "Live music? In this dump? Kid, we're lucky if the jukebox works half the time." Danny took a deep breath. What if I sang for you? For free, I mean. Maybe it would bring in more customers." Darlene stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "You? Sing? Look, kid, I don't know what your deal is, but—" "Please," Danny interrupted, his voice cracking. Just, just let me try. One song. If people don't like it, I'll leave and never bother you again." Something in his desperate expression must have gotten through to Darlene. She sighed, running a hand through her frizzy hair. "Fine, one song. But if Mel comes in and raises hell, I'm telling him it was your idea." Heart pounding, Danny retrieved his MP3 player from his backpack. He scrolled through the tracks, finally selecting one of Grandma Rose's favorites. As the opening notes of "What a Wonderful World" filled the diner, Danny closed his eyes and began to sing. His clear, sweet voice soared above the patter of rain outside. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as patrons turned to stare at the small boy with the angelic voice. Even Darlene stood frozen, coffee pot suspended in midair. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, to Danny's amazement, the diner erupted in applause. An elderly woman in the corner wiped away a tear, while the businessmen who'd been discussing the diner's troubles were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically. Darlene approached Danny, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Kid, I don't know where you came from, but how would you like a job?" For the first time since leaving St. Martha's, Danny felt a glimmer of hope. He had a long way to go before he could help Grandma Rose. But this was a start. Little did he know his impromptu performance had caught the attention of someone else, a sharply dressed man who'd been quietly nursing a coffee in the corner. As Danny beamed at Darlene, the man pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hello? Yeah, it's me. Listen, I think I've just found our next big star." The next few weeks passed in a blur for Danny. His days fell into a routine. He'd wake up early in the small storage room above Mel's diner that Darlene had converted into a makeshift bedroom for him, help with the morning rush, attend to his self-taught lessons using borrowed library books, and then perform during the lunch and dinner hours. Word spread quickly about the boy with the golden voice at Mel's diner. What started as a trickle of curious locals soon became a steady stream of customers, many of whom would leave generous tips in the jar labeled Danny's College Fund that Darlene had set up by the register. Danny knew he should feel elated. The diner was thriving, he had a roof over his head, and his savings were growing. But each night as he counted his earnings, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Grandma Rose's surgery seemed like an ever-distant goal, and the guilt of not being able to contact her gnawed at him constantly. One particularly busy Friday evening, as Danny finished his last set to thunderous applause, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was the sharply dressed man who'd been present on his first night at the diner. Unlike the other patrons who were smiling and clapping, this man wore a calculating expression that made Danny uneasy. As the crowd dispersed, the man approached Danny, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Hello, Danny. I'm Maxwell Green, talent agent extraordinaire." He extended a hand which Danny hesitantly shook. Matork said, "I've been watching your performances, and I must say I'm impressed. How would you like to take your talent to the next level?" Before Danny could respond, Darlene appeared at his side. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what exactly does that mean, Mr. Green?" Maxwell's smile didn't waver. "It means, my dear lady, that young Danny here has the potential to be a star. I'm talking about record deals, national tours, the works. With my connections and his talent, the sky's the limit." Danny's heart raced. This was it, the opportunity he'd been waiting for. With a record deal, he could earn enough for Grandma Rose's surgery in no time. But as he opened his mouth to accept, Darlene cut in. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Green, but Danny's just a child. He's not ready for that kind of pressure." Maxwell's eyes hardened slightly. "With all due respect, Ms. Darlene, just Darlene. Darlene, I think that's for Danny to decide, don't you? After all, it's his future we're talking about." All eyes turned to Danny, who felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath. "Mr. Green, I'm interested, but I need to think about it. Can I have some time?" Maxwell nodded, pulling out a business card. "Of course, my boy. Take all the time you need. But remember, opportunities like this don't come along every day." With a final smile and a nod to Darlene, he left the diner. That night, long after the last customer had gone and Darlene had retired to her apartment next door, Danny sat on his small cot, turning Maxwell's card over and over in his hands. The promise of fame and fortune beckoned, but something about the man's slick demeanor made Danny hesitate. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Danny, can I come in?" It was Darlene. "Sure," he called out. Darlene entered, carrying a steaming mug of hot chocolate. She handed it to Danny and sat beside him on the cot. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. "You know," Darlene finally said, "when I was about your age, I wanted to be a famous chef. Had big dreams of my own cooking show, fancy restaurants, the works." Danny looked up, surprised. "What happened?" Darlene smiled wryly. "Life happened. I realized that sometimes the cost of chasing a big dream is losing sight of what really matters." She paused, studying Danny's face. "I'm not saying you shouldn't go for it, kiddo. You've got a gift, no doubt about that. But just be careful. Make sure it's what you really want." As Darlene stood to leave, Danny blurted out, "I ran away from the orphanage." Darlene froze, her hand on the doorknob. Slowly, she turned back to face him. "I had a feeling there was more to your story." Tears welled up in Danny's eyes as he told her everything. About Grandma Rose, the surgery she needed, his plan to earn money by singing. By the time he finished, Darlene had rejoined him on the cot, her arm around his shoulders. "Oh, Danny," she sighed. "You've been carrying this all on your own, haven't you?" He nodded, wiping his eyes. I need to help her. Mr. Green's offer could be my only chance." Darlene was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up, a determined look in her eyes. "We'll figure this out together, okay? No more going it alone. For now, get some sleep. Tomorrow's another day." As Darlene left, closing the door softly behind her, Danny felt a mix of emotions. Relief at having shared his secret, fear of what might happen next, and a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe things would work out. He clutched Grandma Rose's photo to his chest as he drifted off to sleep, unaware that his world was about to change dramatically once again. The following morning, Danny woke to the sound of hushed voices outside his door. He recognized Darlene's low murmur, but the other voice, gruff and authoritative, was unfamiliar. Heart racing, he crept to the door and pressed his ear against it. "Can't just take him," Darlene was saying. "He's been through enough already." "Ma'am, I understand your concern," the man replied, But harboring a runaway minor is a serious offense. We need to take him back to the orphanage immediately. Danny's blood ran cold. They'd found him. His mind raced, trying to figure out how they'd discovered his whereabouts. Then it hit him, his performances. Someone must have recognized him and reported it. Before he could think of a plan, the door swung open. Danny stumbled back, coming face to face with a stern-looking police officer. Behind him stood Darlene, her eyes red-rimmed and apologetic. "Daniel Thompson?" the officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I'm Officer Benson. I'm here to take you back to St. Martha's orphanage." Danny's legs felt weak. "Please," he whispered. "You don't understand. My grandmother—" "We know about your grandmother, son," Officer Benson said, his voice softening slightly. "St. Martha's has been in contact with her. She's been worried sick about you." A wave of guilt washed over Danny. In his determination to help Grandma Rose, he'd never considered how his disappearance might affect her. Darlene stepped forward, placing a hand on Danny's shoulder. "Officer, isn't there anything we can do? Danny's a good kid, and he's been doing well here." Officer Benson shook his head. "I'm sorry, but the law is clear. He needs to return to his legal guardian, which in this case is St. Martha's." He turned to Danny. "Go ahead and gather your things. We'll wait downstairs." In a daze, Danny packed his few belongings. As he zipped up his backpack, Darlene entered the room, closing the door behind her. "Danny, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I swear I didn't call them. Someone must have—" "It's okay," Danny interrupted, managing a small smile. "I know you wouldn't do that. Thank you for everything, Darlene. I mean it." Darlene pulled him into a tight hug. When she pulled back, there were tears in her eyes, but also a glimmer of determination. "This isn't over, kiddo. I'm going to talk to some people, see what we can do. Don't give up hope, okay?" Danny nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Together, they walked downstairs, where Officer Benson was waiting. The diner was empty, the closed sign hanging in the window. As they reached the police car, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, revealing Maxwell Green's smiling face. "Ah, perfect timing," he said, stepping out of the car. "I was just coming to check on our young star." His eyes flickered to Officer Benson. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Benson explained the situation. As he spoke, Danny saw something change in Maxwell's expression. The smile remained, but his eyes turned calculating. "Officer," Maxwell said smoothly, "perhaps we can come to an arrangement. You see, I represent a very prestigious talent agency. Young Daniel here has extraordinary potential. Sending him back to an orphanage would be a waste of his gift. Don't you agree?" Officer Benson frowned. "Mr. Green, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the law—" Of course," Maxwell interrupted. "But what if we could offer Daniel a stable environment while also nurturing his talent? My agency has programs for young performers, including education and housing, with the orphanage's permission, of course." Danny's heart leapt. Could this be the solution he'd been hoping for? Officer Benson looked uncertain. "That's not really my decision to make. I'd have to consult with St. Martha's and Child Services." Maxwell's smile widened. "Naturally. Why don't we all take a trip to St. Martha's together? We can discuss this properly with all parties involved." As the adults continued to talk, Danny's mind whirled. This could be his chance, not just to help Grandma Rose, but to pursue his dreams. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Was he ready for what Maxwell was offering? And at what cost would it come? Darlene seemed to sense his turmoil. She knelt beside him, speaking low so only he could hear. "Remember what I said last night, Danny. Make sure this is what you really want. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Danny nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. As they all piled into their respective vehicles, Danny with Officer Benson, Maxwell following in his sedan, and Darlene bringing up the rear in her old pickup truck, he realized that the next few hours would likely determine the course of his entire future. As St. Martha's orphanage came into view, Danny took a deep breath. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he was determined to face it head on. For Grandma Rose, for his dreams, and for himself. The familiar iron gates of St. Martha's orphanage loomed before them as Officer Benson's police car pulled into the circular driveway. Danny's stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As they exited the vehicle, he noticed Maxwell's sleek sedan and Darlene's battered pickup truck parking behind them. Mrs. Hartley, the orphanage director, was already waiting on the front steps. Her stern face softened slightly at the sight of Danny, relief evident in her eyes. "Daniel," she said, her voice a mix of concern and reproach, "we've been worried sick about you." Before Danny could respond, Maxwell stepped forward, hand extended. "Mrs. Hartley, I presume. Maxwell Green, Starlight Talent Agency. I believe we have much to discuss regarding young Daniel's future." Mrs. Hartley's eyebrows rose as she shook Maxwell's hand. "Indeed we do, Mr. Green. Please, all of you, come inside." As they followed Mrs. Hartley to her office, Danny felt a gentle squeeze on his shoulder. He looked up to see Darlene giving him an encouraging smile. The small gesture bolstered his courage. Once they were all seated in Mrs. Hartley's cramped office, the discussion began in earnest. Maxwell laid out his proposal, a comprehensive program for young talents that included education, housing, and professional development. Mrs. Hartley listened intently, her expression unreadable. "It's an intriguing offer, Mr. Green," she said when he finished. "But I'm concerned about Daniel's well-being. He's been through a lot, and the entertainment industry can be challenging for young performers." "I understand your concerns," Maxwell replied smoothly. "But consider the opportunities this would provide for Daniel. With his talent, he could have a bright future ahead of him." As the adults debated, Danny's mind wandered to Grandma Rose. He hadn't allowed himself to think about her much since his escape, the guilt too overwhelming. Now, faced with the possibility of pursuing his dreams, he found himself torn. Suddenly, a quiet knock interrupted the discussion. Mrs. Hartley's assistant poked her head in. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent call for Daniel. It's his grandmother." The room fell silent. Danny's heart raced as Mrs. Hartley nodded, gesturing for him to take the call at her desk. With trembling hands, Danny picked up the phone. "Grandma Rose." "Oh, Danny!" His grandmother's voice, weak but filled with love, brought tears to his eyes. "My dear boy, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Grandma," Danny choked out. "I'm so sorry I ran away. I just wanted to help you." "Shh. It's okay, sweetheart," Grandma Rose soothed. "I understand, but you don't need to worry about me. The doctors, they found a clinical trial. I'm getting the surgery next week, free of charge." Danny's legs went weak with relief. "Really? Oh, Grandma, that's wonderful." "It is," she agreed. "Now, Danny, I need you to listen to me. Whatever opportunities come your way, whatever dreams you want to pursue, do it because it's what you truly want, not because you think you need to save me. Your happiness is what matters most to me. Do you understand?" Tears streaming down his face, Danny nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "Yes, Grandma, I understand." After a few more words of love and encouragement, Danny hung up the phone. He turned to face the room, suddenly aware that all eyes were on him. Mrs. Hartley broke the silence. "Daniel, is everything all right?" Taking a deep breath, Danny explained about Grandma Rose's upcoming surgery. As he spoke, he felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he finished, Maxwell was the first to speak. "Well, this is wonderful news. Now, Daniel, we can focus fully on your career without any distractions." But as Danny looked around the room, at Maxwell's eager smile, Mrs. Hartley's concerned frown, Officer Benson's neutral expression, and finally, Darlene's supportive gaze, he realized something important. "Mr. Green," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I'm grateful for your offer, but I don't think I'm ready for that kind of commitment." Maxwell's smile faltered. "But Daniel, think of the opportunity you'd be passing up." Danny shook his head. "I love singing, and maybe someday I'll want to pursue it professionally. But right now, I think I need to focus on just being a kid, on spending time with my grandmother when she recovers, on my education, and on figuring out who I am outside of my voice." The room was silent for a moment. Then, to Danny's surprise, Mrs. Hartley spoke up. "I think that's a very mature decision, Daniel." Darlene beamed at him, pride shining in her eyes. Even Officer Benson gave an approving nod. Maxwell, however, looked disappointed. "Well, if that's your decision, here's my card in case you change your mind." He stood, nodded curtly to the room, and left. As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Hartley turned to Danny. "So, Daniel, what would you like to do now?" Danny thought for a moment. "I'd like to stay here at St. Martha's, at least until Grandma Rose recovers. But would it be okay if I still sang at Darlene's diner sometimes? Not for money, just for fun?" Mrs. Hartley smiled, a rare occurrence that transformed her stern face. I think we can arrange that. As the details were worked out, supervised visits to the diner, increased communication with Grandma Rose, and a promise from Danny to focus on his studies, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was excited to find out. Later that evening, as Danny settled into his old bed at the orphanage, he pulled out the photo of him and Grandma Rose. Tracing her smiling face with his finger, he whispered, "I'll make you proud, Grandma, I promise." And as he drifted off to sleep, a soft melody played in his mind, not of fame or fortune, but of love, family, and the simple joy of singing from the heart. 3 years had passed since Danny's great adventure, and life had settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. At 13, he was taller now, his voice deepening with the first signs of adolescence, but his eyes still sparkled with the same determination and joy. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and Danny was helping Darlene set up for the evening rush at Mel's Diner. The place had changed over the years: new paint, updated menu, even a small stage in the corner where local musicians performed on weekends. But the heart of the diner remained the same, filled with the warmth and comfort of home. "You excited about tonight, kiddo?" Darlene asked, wiping down the counter. Danny grinned. "Nervous, but yeah, it's been a while since I've performed here." Tonight was special. It was the third anniversary of what they now jokingly called the Great Escape, and Danny was doing a one-night-only performance to celebrate. Mrs. Hartley had given her permission, and even some of the other kids from St. Martha's were coming to watch. As the afternoon wore on, the diner began to fill up. Danny spotted familiar faces, regulars who'd been coming to hear him sing since he was 10. Some of his teachers from school, and even Officer Benson, off duty and smiling. At precisely 7 p.m., Darlene dimmed the lights and stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to our stage the one and only Danny Thompson." The diner erupted in applause as Danny took the stage. He'd grown more confident over the years, but he still felt that familiar flutter of nerves as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady. "This song is for someone very special, someone who taught me that sometimes the best dreams are the ones we didn't even know we had." As the opening notes of "What a Wonderful World" filled the diner, Danny's eyes found the person he was looking for. Sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride, was Grandma Rose. Her recovery had been slow but steady. She wasn't able to care for Danny full time anymore, but she visited often, and Danny spent every school break with her. Their relationship had grown stronger than ever, built on a foundation of mutual understanding and unconditional love. As Danny sang, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. The fear and desperation that had driven him to run away seemed like a distant memory now. In its place was gratitude for Darlene's unwavering support, for Mrs. Hartley's guidance, for the friends he'd made at St. Martha's, and for the chance to pursue his passions at his own pace. He'd continued to sing, but on his own terms. Weekend performances at the diner, school choir, even some local competitions. But he'd also discovered other interests: a knack for math that surprised everyone, including himself, a love for writing that allowed him to express himself in new ways, and a growing interest in social work, inspired by his own experiences. As the final notes of the song faded away, the diner erupted in applause once more. Danny bowed, his heart full. He stepped off the stage and was immediately enveloped in a warm hug from Grandma Rose. "I'm so proud of you, my little songbird," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Grandma," Danny replied, hugging her tightly. "For everything." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, laughter, and more music. As the last customers trickled out, Danny found himself sitting at the counter with Darlene, just like old times. "You know," Darlene said, sliding a slice of apple pie in front of him, "I always knew you were something special, kid. But watching you grow up, seeing the young man you're becoming, it's been an honor." Danny felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Darlene. You gave me a chance when I needed it most." Darlene ruffled his hair affectionately. "You did all the hard work yourself, kiddo. I just provided the pancakes." They laughed together, the sound mingling with the soft jazz playing on the jukebox. As Danny savored his pie, he thought about the future stretching out before him. High school was just around the corner, and beyond that, who knew? College, maybe? A career in music or social work or something he hadn't even considered yet. But whatever came next, Danny knew he was ready to face it. He had a family. Not the traditional kind, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. He had his voice, not just for singing, but for speaking up for what he believed in. And he had the lessons learned from his great adventure about courage, about perseverance, and about the power of staying true to oneself. As the neon sign of Mel's diner flickered in the twilight, casting a warm glow over the street, Danny realized that his journey had come full circle. He'd set out to change his grandmother's life, but in the end, it was his own life that had been transformed. And as he helped Darlene close up the diner, humming softly to himself, Danny knew that the best was yet to come. His adventure, it seemed, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The end.